the people calling in on the phone a chance to weigh in as well. But thank you everyone for joining us. Again, my name is Matt Landers. I'm Public Policy and Government Relations Director here at GSBA, Washington's LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce. We've got some great advocates with us here tonight. We're very excited to hear what the 2020 legislative session has to offer us this term. So maybe I will start with Monisha, since you are the board chair of Equal Rights Washington. I'll let you kick us off, introduce yourself, name, affiliation, pronouns, and some of the things you are working on in Olympia.
Fantastic. And Carrie, please interject if there's anything that you wanna add. My name is Monisha Harrell, she, her pronouns. I am the board chair for Equal Rights Washington. I have a little bit of the winter flu, so I am sparing all of you from my in-person presence. But for this year, we've got some unfinished business from last year that we're kind of working on. And one of the biggest pieces of that unfinished business is the banning trans panic and gay panic as a legal defense for violence against the LGBTQ community. We have been fortunate enough to not have this be something that's epidemic here, but even one case is too many. And we have had and we are seeing with the increase in hate speech that there's an increase in hate crime, as well as there's actions that come from that. And so we are in a push right now to ensure that we are another state that will ban that as a legal defense for violence. We have introduced that this is the third year of this bill fully going forward, and we believe pretty strongly that this is the year that it will get passed. For those following the bill, it is House Bill 1687. Carrie, is there anything you want to add on that legislation?
No, Monisha, just wait a second. I need to unmute her here.
Okay.
Go.
Yes, I'll just let you know, as Monisha was saying, it passed it's on the House floor already, so there will not be another hearing in the House on this bill. It'll move directly from the House floor to the Senate, and that will be the first opportunity to do some advocacy there. So we'll let everybody know when that occurs.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carrie. There are a couple other bills that have been introduced before, and we are looking forward to them moving. They might not make it all the way to the finish line this year, but the LGBTQ Veterans Coordinator bill now has a matching bill in the Senate. That's House Bill 1650 and Senate Bill 5900. There's a lot of support behind that bill. It has been introduced before, and we feel very strongly that this is something that, given a time when our federal administration has been pushing out many LGBTQ service members, particularly trans service members, having the additional ability to support our communities is really critical and really important, and the least that Washington State can do in order to ensure that those who serve have the resources that they need in service and coming out of service. A couple of other things that we are working on this year, we are working on supporting the HIV modernization bill. This is something that activists have been working on for a very, very long time. That is House Bill 1551, Senate Bill 5562. And that is decriminalization of HIV in community, and something that is very close to the heart of a lot who are in the healthcare space, including our speaker, Lori Jenkins, our House Speaker, Lori Jenkins, and we are looking forward to supporting that bill as much as possible. Carrie, is there anything you want to add on those two bills?
Am I off mute?
Yeah, you're on mute.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Matt, for unmuting me again. Well, 1551 is also sitting on the House rules, ready to go. We've been working. It is modernizing the HIV statute. It's a big bill, as Monisha mentioned, been worked on for quite a while. It will be moving. There's some technical amendments we'll be working on, but other than that, and we're scheduling for a hearing in the Senate. And then the Veterans Coordinator bills, we're hoping that those do move forward. There is fiscal that we are trying to work with, and that was one of the things holding them up last year. And can I mention one more bill that's being heard tomorrow? So last year, now, Speaker Jenkins had a bill 1447 regarding the mental health parity law. This year, Representative Macri has dropped a bill, similar bill on 2338, and it's the healthcare discrimination bill, and it has a hearing tomorrow at 1:30. And what this does is in our health, as we are dealing with a lot of changes on a federal level in the ACA, we're really being clear that in Washington State, we do not discriminate, especially on gender identity. And we see mental health services being quite broad, including, even making sure that we're including the substance abuse and others. So if there's any changes on the federal level, our Attorney General's office and our Office of Insurance Commissioner can make sure that the citizens of Washington get all those hosts of care that they need, regardless of how they identify. And there's been quite a bit of support for this. So we'll be hearing that tomorrow at 1:30.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carrie. And then there's only one other bill I want to talk about. It was just dropped last week. It's a piece of legislation around anti-swatting, so increasing penalties around those who would deliberately call law enforcement, call 911 in order to trigger an emergency response at somebody's home or business, usually home of somebody who they consider a political foe. And it's called anti-swatting because it basically, they create an emergency that would send out the SWAT team to basically interrupt this person's home and potentially trigger physical harm or even death. And so we've had some high profile incidents of that recently in Washington State. Seattle Police Department is one of the only police departments that actually has an anti-swatting registry, where if somebody thinks that they may be a target of this sort of behavior, they can actually proactively alert Seattle Police Department and let them know that before you respond to any 911 action at the home, please verify that that is indeed the case. And that legislation is House Bill 2632 with matching Senate Bill 6295. We're not sure how far that'll get this year because we're just introducing it. And part of it is coming from the hate crimes legislation that was passed last year. The hate crimes legislation passed last year was a number of communities coming together, the Jewish community, Muslim community, Latino community, immigrants, refugees, and the LGBTQ community coming together to address the increase in the number of hate crimes around Washington State. We are the number 2 for hate crimes behind California, despite not being number 2 in terms of number of residents. So we know that there is a significant problem here. And as we've been joining to discuss how we might address what we see as potential solutions for the increase in hate crimes, this anti-swatting legislation kind of came forward as one of the early recommendations of something we can do. So instead of waiting until the full slate of recommendations are ready for next year, the anti-swatting legislation is being introduced this year in order to give this one a little bit of a head start. So that's what I wanted to share with everybody today. Matt, we can go to some of the other presenters, or if there's anybody who's got immediate questions.
Great, thank you, Monisha. We are going to move on to, thank you for calling in from Snohomish. We hope you feel better and thanks that you were able to call into us. Now moving from Snohomish down to Olympia with Tobi Hill-Meyer. You are now unmuted. Please introduce yourself, your position, your pronouns, and we'd love to hear a little bit about what you are working on in Olympia this year. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, definitely. So my name's Tobi Hill-Meyer. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the co-executive directors of Gender Justice League. As Matt just mentioned, I've moved down to Olympia, so I'm based around here now, which gives me a good opportunity to jump in on more hearings and various other things like this. So looking at some of the different bills that we're following, there's a lot, so I just wanted to focus on a couple, especially ones that I thought might not be mentioned by other speakers. So for one, I do want to mention, Monisha mentioned the bill to ban panic defenses. And I think something very worth noting is that one of the big reasons why it didn't have much momentum last year is because there is a perception that that's not a thing that happens in Washington, or that the Washington law is written too tightly for that to be a significant concern. And that has changed significantly since there was a 17-year-old trans girl who was murdered last summer, and is now, only a couple of weeks ago, they arrested somebody and are moving forward with a case that very much seems to conform to the narrative of trans panic. That happening right now changes how a lot of people are thinking and feeling about the bill, and I see more momentum building up behind it because of that. And I've been working with Nikki's family to try to get the bill renamed to be the Nikki Kuhnhausen Act, which I think it would be really meaningful. Then another bill that I wanted to mention is an interesting one that it's House Bill 651. Wait, did I get that right? That looks wrong, actually. I might need to double check this. But anyway, it's an adult entertainment bill where last year there was a bill to provide safety for adult entertainers and dancers, specifically having a panic button in any private rooms and that kind of thing. And expanding on it, yep, I did have it right. The numbers threw me off because it starts with a 6, but it's House Bill 6517. And the issue that I think is worth noting right now is that the definition of adult entertainer is written very broadly. And for a safety bill, that's really helpful. But this year's bill is more around some of the finances of things. And so by having it written broadly, it can include burlesque performers and drag performers. It's any kind of erotic performance. And what is worth paying attention to is that the bill would prohibit any organization from providing payments to regularly scheduled performers. Now, the reason for that is that in strip clubs, there is a huge issue about whether people are classified as contractors or employees. And basically, this is saying if someone has a regular schedule, then they should be an employee, not a contractor. But what this means is it's not understanding the model that most burlesque and drag performers use, which is not to make income solely on tips, but to usually get like a payment from the organizer, and then the organizer gets money from door fees. So hopefully this is just a misunderstanding and it can be resolved quickly when talking to the sponsors, but it's just something to be aware of, especially if it doesn't get resolved quickly, because of the potential of having an impact on members of our community who probably don't know anything about this bill. Then also there's a bill coming up that requires hotels to provide training around anti-trafficking. This one is House Bill 2320. And this is one that it looks good at first, but there's a lot of things that come up from it that are very concerning, and it's something that we just really have to be careful about, because it's going to be requiring that all of the hotels have training, but it seems to focus on the purpose of that training is to get hotel employees to call the police when they see signs of trafficking. What we know from how most of these trainings work is that they don't actually make any differentiation to see signs of coercion. They only are looking for signs of sexual activity or specifically signs of sex work. And so this becomes a kind of situation where it is encouraging harassment of people who are engaging in sex in hotels. This is also usually a very sexist approach to harassment, because usually it's only women who are receiving this kind of harassment from police officers and hotel administrators. But we've also seen cases where there's like an interracial couple who checks in separately, and then the hotel staff like refuses to give someone a key, or even just becomes a big conflict. And then of course, you know, even with the end goal of having arrests when there is victimization, unfortunately, that is not usually a good way to resolve exploitation, especially because inviting the police in, calling the police on people, it usually means arresting the person who is engaging in sex work or is the trafficking victim. And we don't need to be harassing trafficking victims. So that's one that we're wanting to advise on. There's some pieces of it that make sense, like having posters available for where people can call for resources if they want resources, but just if people don't want resources, forcing them to have resources against their consent by using the violence of a police arrest is not a good solution. Finally, I do want to mention House Bill 2201, which is about trans girls in sports. I don't think this is one we have to pay super close attention to. It is not going to move anywhere at all. There's not the support to get it passed. But it is important to be aware of. It's already sparking some conversation, some media attention. And so a couple of things to note about this bill is it specifically says that trans girls in high school must compete in boys' sports. And it also specifically does not say anything about trans boys. Which is an interesting approach that they've taken. They've probably seen cases where trans boys were forced to compete in girls' sports, and that did not play well with an anti-trans base, since the entire argument is about men competing with girls. But by leaving that part out, it becomes a pretty blatant violation of Title IX, where there is a rule specifically preventing girls from competing in sports that does not apply to boys. So that's something worth pointing out if you do get in conversations about it. If people ask, how should this be handled? How do you handle students who are competing in sports and are trans. It's complicated because usually when we talk about trans people in sports, we point to the Olympic Committee, which has a pretty decent set of guidelines about how to handle that. But one of the requirements is having been on hormones for at least a year, which is not a requirement that really makes sense for middle and high schools. So I point people to the GLSEN website, which actually has a pretty decent breakdown of how to create a more comprehensive system that can look to everybody's best interests when trying to figure out how to handle trans students engaging in sports. And the one final thing that I want to say about this bill and why I think it's important to be aware of, even if it's not going to have much movement, is that we know that the anti-LGBTQ forces across the country have come together with a plan called Project Blitz, which is where they're going to be trying to introduce a number of different things all around the country, and with the intent of overwhelming us and the resources we have available to address all of the different issues and bills that they're bringing up. And so it's not so much the impact this bill has in Washington state, but the fact that this bill or a near identical version of it has been introduced in several states, and that there's also another bill targeting trans youth that has been introduced in several states. It's not in Washington, but just last week, about a half dozen states introduced a bill that would make it a crime for a doctor to prescribe hormone or puberty blockers to trans youth, which of course is like pretty serious to then say that the doctor would be criminally responsible. And it doesn't say anything about parents. It's like, even if the parents are on board and going to the doctor and then the doctor writes the prescription, that would be illegal under these bills. So there's not a huge worry that we're going to see much traction on those things, but it definitely is concerning that that is the starting point that they're trying to push as a wedge, and to try to like, you know, to split us and create controversy and create talking points that uninformed people might think are reasonable, and so it's definitely something to keep an eye on, as a nationwide issue, in addition to just the state.
Thank you so much, Toby. That's great. You've actually already even answered a couple of the questions I had prepared for later, so thank you.
Yeah.
We are now going to move on to our third panelist, who is here at the GSBA office with me. Catherine, go ahead. Again, name, affiliation, pronouns, and take it away with your legislative agenda.
Thank you, Matt. My name is Catherine West. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a fairly new attorney at Legal Voice and have picked up what used to be David Ward's body of work. So that includes family law, LGBTQ advocacy, and gender-based violence. I formerly worked in legal services, so I spent 15 years representing low-income individuals, families, and youth at Northwest Justice Project. And as part of that work, I represented a number of trans youth in trying to either change gender marker or name or obtain Medicaid coverage for gender-affirming surgeries. So that's sort of my background, and was really excited to join Legal Voice and really glad to be here tonight. So there's a few bills that I'd like to talk about, but then really interested to hear what you folks are thinking and interested in, and perhaps the three of us and Matt as well can try and answer those questions. So within the area of gender-based violence, something that impacts survivors of violence is, of course, not only trying to get physically and mentally safe and away from their abuser, but often we find that even if a survivor is able to achieve a level of physical safety, the abuser will often turn to different mechanisms to exert power and control over the survivor in a different way. And so one of the ways that that happens is through the court system. Abusers will engage in what we call abusive litigation to drag survivors into court, maybe on a repeated basis, filing baseless motions, causing the survivor to miss work, arrange for childcare, and have to continually, respond to sometimes issues that have already been decided by the court. Another way that abusive litigation comes up is, trying to harass or embarrass a survivor. So perhaps trying to get information about their health records or mental health records out into the public. So there's lots of little ways that abusers can use the court system to further abuse a survivor. And so with that framework in mind, we, Legal Voice, the Northwest Justice Project, and Lavender Rights Project came together to try and draft a very narrowly tailored bill to address abusive litigation. And Senator Wolfus introduced that bill. It's Senate Bill 6268. And the reason why it's important that it's a narrowly tailored bill is the fear was that if we were to offer up a broad bill to try and address abusive litigation in a broad way, that very crafty abusers would be able to use that legislation to, again, further abuse and harass survivors. So, sometimes this is difficult for people to comprehend or understand how that could be possible. And so it would be important to note that sometimes survivors who are taking very protective actions to protect their children, protect themselves, may, file a number of documents with the court. If the survivor, if a child discloses sexual abuse to, their parent, the survivor, of course the survivor is going to, to do everything within their power to respond and get help and put that information before the court. And unfortunately, it is not uncommon for parents who allege and put forth allegations of sexual abuse against their children may end up losing custody of their children if the court finds either the survivor is not credible or that they just don't believe that the allegations are true. So with that framework in mind, and just anecdotally, by way of example, a survivor called me today with that exact scenario. She had heard that Legal Voice was working on abusive litigation, trying to address it, and she relayed a story where she lost custody of her child. It's been a number of years now, and it was because she raised, what she felt were very real concerns of sexual abuse. So, having said that, this bill is, it only applies to parties that have had an intimate partner relationship. So it's not for other categories of relationships like siblings or parent and child. And it's embedded within the Domestic Violence Protection Act. And within the Domestic Violence Protection Act, a survivor can go to court to seek a protective order to limit contact with the abuser, and may create other protections around whatever interaction that they would have. We felt that that was important because that would mean that the court has already made a finding that the abuser has engaged in acts of domestic violence, and that the court has already found that those parties have a sufficient relationship in order to make that kind of finding. And so only a survivor with a protective order could seek a hearing in front of a judge either during the act of obtaining the protective order or up to 5 years after the court has made a finding of domestic violence. The survivor could go back up to 5 years later to say, explain the circumstances and ask the court for an order restricting abusive litigation. And that order would have the effect of creating what are called pre-filing restrictions on the abuser. So in other words, that abuser doesn't have unfettered access to the courts anymore with regard to filing an action against that survivor. And the abuser would have the right to file another action, but would have to go before the same judicial officer that entered the order making a finding of order restricting abusive litigation. I'm trying to think of any other features. Oh, one of the other things related to survivors losing custody of their children in regard to taking protective action, there is a concept in the Divorce Act called abusive use of conflict. And to my mind, the spirit of that concept is, parents who are really using their children or, maybe trying to involve the children in whatever difficult conversations or, really going above and beyond your average divorce case. If the court makes the finding of abusive use of conflict, that can be a basis for the court to enter restrictions on that parent's contact with the child. So it's a really big deal. And so this bill also clarifies or offers as a definition of the abusive use of conflict to be something along the same lines of abusive use of litigation. So again, filing repeated baseless claims, filing case after case after case around the same issue that the court has already decided, someone who's showing a pattern of really abusing the litigation system. So this bill has a hearing on Thursday morning, and we'd welcome anyone to come and testify or provide written feedback. I do think, given the volume of survivors that we're aware of that have experienced this issue, that hopefully people will show up and sort of tell their story, because unless you really engage with survivors around this issue, it can be very difficult to imagine that that is the state of the law right now and what is happening. And to be fair, really this bill doesn't offer anything that isn't already possible under existing law. The reality, however, is that's not 100% true, but there are a lot of features under existing law that a judge could fashion in order to provide a protective solution for a survivor. The reality is that courts are very reluctant to do that, particularly if the abuser is a pro se unrepresented party. So we really think that this will empower courts and also could possibly make courts feel more empowered to restrain what is going on in their courtroom. So that is certainly something we've worked a lot on. There's a couple other bills. Tobi mentioned the Trans Girls in Sports bill. That's not going to go anywhere, but is just good to know about nationwide that is happening. There's a rape kit reform bill. It's House Bill 2318. This closes some loopholes in existing law to better support survivors of sexual assault. And it creates some common sense procedures for survivors of sexual assault and what would happen after the survivor has a rape kit conducted, including meaning that the police would have to retain not just the actual rape kit, the swab and the evidence there, but in addition, the other evidence that the survivor may have, whether it's, clothing, bodily fluids, really kind of creating and maintaining the evidence around the rape kit. And then also allowing the hospital to transmit that rape kit to the police and requiring the police to retain it until a survivor, if and until a survivor makes a police report about the underlying rape. The police have not consistently retained the rape kit. So in other words, a survivor who goes to a medical facility to have a rape kit performed, it shouldn't be the responsibility of the hospital to maintain this evidence. It really should be law enforcement that's retaining the evidence. And particularly with the extended statute of limitations for rape in Washington State, it's really, even more important that we're retaining the evidence around these crimes and supporting survivors of sexual assault. Something that's near and dear to my heart is voter rights. Although not, squarely an LGBTQ issue, it certainly does impact all of us. And when I think about the upcoming election and people participating in our democracy and really feeling invested and involved, in my mind, having as many people able to vote and participate in our democracy is really one of the most important things. So Senate Bill 6228 creates an automatic restoration of the right to vote, excuse me, after someone has completed total confinement. And so, certainly people who have left prison but maybe still under parole or have other conditions of probation, in the past, first of all, may have not been, certainly they wouldn't have been automatically restored the right to vote, but second of all, they would have had to wait out all of those conditions. So this is important because it doesn't require anyone to take any special action to get the right to vote back. It's an automatic restoration. And then it's also right after period of the period of total confinement. You may have followed, there's been a lot, I think, in the media and the news around what are called LFOs, legal financial obligations. And those legal financial obligations, all those fees and fines that are incurred after and during the criminal case can be astoundingly high. And so it would be conceivable that if someone hadn't paid off their LFOs, they might not be able to restore their right to vote. But I give a caveat on that I'm not positive that was the case under existing law. But I think this is a really important thing to support. And also when we think about, again, getting everyone involved in voting and active, I would love to see something like this passed in Washington State. There's some other bills, but I'd love to hear from the community about what you're thinking about and what you're interested in to see if there's something else we should be talking about.
Perfect, thank you, Catherine. And Fedra Saeed Ibrahim was supposed to join us as well. Unfortunately, she got stuck in traffic coming back from Olympia, something that I think everyone, all the panelists here have experienced several times. So we are sorry she can't be here with us, but we're glad she is doing the work.
Yes.
So again, reminder for everyone, if you are using the online feature, please type if you have a question and I can unmute your feed. People on the phone, I'll give you a second in a minute as well to share your voice. In the meantime, Monisha, could you share a little bit of background on what it means to have a short session this year in Washington State?
Absolutely. So a short session means that there's not a lot of time for additional education. Bills that are being introduced, usually there's a little bit of a lead up to educating legislators, bringing constituents to them around an issue. And so there's not as much of that time. If if an issue isn't already kind of noteworthy or hot in terms of people already knowing about it. Additionally, it means that the budget has largely been set, and this is just a tweaking of the budget that was set during the longer session, which means bills that might have a large fiscal note probably will have a much harder time going somewhere during a short session. And so an example of that might be an STI treatment bill from our own Senator Leas from the LGBTQ caucus. There is a bill which is something I think we should be pushing for in the future around PEP and PrEP, but there is a substantial fiscal note around that particular bill. And so that's something that is great to introduce in a short session, but likely doesn't have much of an opportunity to move forward unless there was some enormous windfall in the state's financial position. And, I think that we're a little bit realistic on some things, such as some of the monies coming out of transportation and other things. It is not likely that something with a huge fiscal note is going to move in this particular session. So short session means not a lot of wiggle room in the budget, and also not a lot of lobbying room around issues and topics that don't already have a tremendous amount of buzz about them.
Very nice, thank you. And all three of you have mentioned a couple of bills, I believe, that got introduced last year in the 2019 long session. For those who aren't as familiar with the process in Olympia, what does that mean for those bills that are carrying over into the second session of the biennium?
Well, I'll start. So the upside is some of these bills have already gotten a hearing. So they get to kind of skip ahead in the process if they've already had a hearing. So that's not something that we have to do on some of those bills. And that again means that it's got a little bit of a head start on getting further down the line in terms of moving forward. That all said, there's a fresh start at the end of this session. So those bills that don't pass at the end of this session, the slate is wiped clean and we start all over again at the beginning of next session. So when you've got a bill that's got a little bit of a head start, you want to see what is it that I can do to push this forward, to get this through this session. Otherwise, that next session, you're basically starting from scratch again. Now, there are some pros and cons to that, right? No piece of legislation I've ever seen is ever perfect. And so one of the pros is if there was something with the language that wasn't 100%, you can tweak it a little bit before it's introduced again. The cons are you've got a somewhat new set of legislators who some are already going to be on board with your legislation, and some are going to get elected during this in-between cycle. This short cycle here, nobody wants to stay late from a legislative perspective because they've all got seats to run for. And that's just realistic. That's, they cannot fundraise, they cannot work on their campaigns while they're in session. And there's no desire, from what I sense, there is zero desire to stay in late so that people can get to the jobs of, running again. The other piece of that is we've got a couple of open seats. We've got some people who did some moving around this last session. Some new legislators that are filling seats that were recently vacated to run for higher office. And so you always have to kind of pay attention to the change of the landscape. And that could be as you're looking at, well, let's push this bill this year because we don't know what our landscape will be next year. Or, you know what, we might even have a more favorable basis for passing this next year. You have to make all of those kind of political determinations when you're introducing a bill or pushing a bill forward.
Great, thank you, Monisha. And then for any of the three of you, we have in Washington State now, very first in history, Speaker of the House, Lori Jenkins, the first woman Speaker of the House and the first out first out LGBTQ speaker in Washington's history. This is a great moment for, I think, everybody in the community. Speaker Jenkins has been a phenomenal ally to all of us over the years, from when she was working in the movement to when she was in the legislature. And now here she is leading one of our chambers, and this is very exciting. Do any of you think that there will be any significant differences being led by Speaker Jenkins now as a woman, as an LGBTQ person, even though our pro-LGBTQ majorities have not changed in Washington since last year?
I would love to jump on this one just because I was very, very excited about it. It was fitting that I was driving when the votes were being taken for this, and so immediately got a call. My wife, I didn't know, had been watching the votes, had been watching the news coming out from their closed door session. And so she was the first one I was able to hear it from, and it was remarkable. What I will say is this, Speaker Jenkins is a very good reason as to why, when we had 2 years of anti-trans legislation, that those weren't able to go anywhere, right? They had to go through her committee, and she did not fold under any pressure to even give those a hearing. She was getting so many calls to her office that her admin was not able to keep up with them. They were flooding her nonstop for weeks and weeks and weeks, and she did not flinch and did not move. That is a huge, huge sign for those who would introduce anti-LGBTQ legislation. If, as a committee chair, she will not even give a hearing, she will not even mention the names in her committee, that sends a very strong message to them that their legislation has nowhere to go with her as Speaker of the House. And so it allows us to do a couple of different things as an LGBTQ constituency group. It allows us to not have to spend so much time playing defense. It means that we get to spend more time fighting for rights for our community versus just fighting to stay in place. And that is unbelievably remarkable. And I urge all of us to take this opportunity to not only do that, fight for where we want to go and what we want to be, but use this time to lay the groundwork that other states can follow. Because other states really are watching how we do this work, and we will be laying the blueprints for how they will be able to say, look, we don't have as favorable a legislation, we don't have the resources, we don't have the lawyers, we don't have those things. So they'll look at our legislation, they'll look at the way we word things, they'll look at the way things go up through our court system to be defended. And where they have fewer resources, they'll be looking to us as the model. So with Speaker Jenkins, this is our opportunity. And I hope every one of us, I'm looking at all the names on this phone call, and I know each one of you is power players in what you do. And it's our responsibility at this point that Speaker Jenkins will hold the line for us. We have to then come in with all of our tools to be able to push it forward.
And that's a perfect segue, Monisha, into some of the questions I've been receiving now. First of all, to start off, are any of the bills that the three of you have mentioned tonight particularly viable, but need some organizing, some public input to help actually get passed? And then what is kind of the most effective way to do that? So Tobi or Catherine, maybe give you a chance to respond to some of those. Are any of the bills you mentioned ones that could use some extra oomph from the community?
Tobi, do you want to go first, or?
Sure. So I'll say that the Nikki Kuhnhausen Act is one that seems real set to move through the House quickly. And then it'll be headed over to the Senate, and that's where it could use an extra push. So yeah, I have less of a sense of what things look like in the Senate around that bill. but it would be helpful to get a bit of a push there, especially around the Law and Justice Committee, which it's going to have to go through, where it would have a hearing in the Senate, so if you are able to go to that hearing when we put out the announcement that the hearing's been scheduled, that would be wonderful. If you can, like, even just write an email to the members of that committee. I believe it's chaired by Senator Peterson.
Great, thank you. And Toby, you said that's the Nikki Kuhnhausen Act?
Yes, the gay and trans panic ban.
Perfect, thank you.
Well, I would love to see this abusive litigation bill pass. I think it could really set up survivors to have some additional protections. Whether that needs a nudge, I guess I'm not really sure, although I see Pam Crone is on the line, and so she might be able to weigh in and give us that answer. And, you know, again, frankly, I understand the spirit of the question, but I would love to see so many more people just like looking at the legislature website and seeing what they're up to and kind of weighing in as a practice, because there's, like Monisha said, I mean, honestly, when Monisha was talking, I was feeling like so inspired and excited because there's a lot of negative stuff happening all over the world and in other states. And it is true that we're very fortunate, privileged to live in a state where LGBTQ liberation, equality is really moving forward. And that's hugely exciting. And I think making sure that we're taking care of each other and standing in solidarity with not only the LGBTQ community, but other communities that have been marginalized in history and in the past and in the present day, is such a lovely thing to be able to do, to share our success and our power with others that have not enjoyed the same privileges.
And Monisha, I think you have one of the best ways for everybody on this call to get engaged and talk with their legislators. Give you a moment to plug February 11th.
Absolutely. So February 11th, Tuesday, February 11th, we have an LGBTQ lobby day. It will be in Olympia. We invite anybody and everybody to come and join us for that particular lobby day, all ages. We have activities for all ages. We found that young people sometimes have more of an influence, particularly with some of our more conservative legislators, than we do as adults. We will feed you breakfast and lunch. We will have speakers, and we will have a list of bills to go and lobby our legislators to participate. We have a sign up and RSVP on Equal Rights Washington's website on the homepage. And, like I said, we will feed you, we will take care of you. We will do a lobbying 101 to show everybody how to lobby and how to continue to have your voices heard even after lobby day is completed. So we would love anybody and everybody to join us for that.
Great, thank you, Monisha. And there was a question about listing bill numbers. I will email out everyone the list of bills mentioned by the panelists. It may be a little overwhelming to hear over audio, so I will send it to you all in an email, so it'll be easy to reference, easy for you to track as well. Let's see, and now, let's see. I've got time for 1 or 2 more questions. Everybody on the phone, be ready. I'm gonna unmute you all so you have a chance to ask a question if you need to, since you can't indicate it by text. So phone people, you are all currently unmuted. Do any of you have a question?
Yes, this is Troy in Tacoma. Has there been any movement at all on House Bill 2201? Is that something we need to continue to watch?
So 2201 would be Representative Clifford's bill on trans girls in school athletics. So Toby, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, no, there hasn't been any movement on it. It's mostly something we need to be aware of where conversation is happening, and be engaged in those media conversations. Like there was an article that came out of the Tri-Cities Herald, where the representative who introduced the bill is from, I got to talk to that reporter, and it's just, you know, being able to see when they know this is not going to pass. They're putting this out to kind of try to push forward a conversation, and we need to make sure that we're present when that conversation is being had. So it's more of a media issue than actually whether this will actually pass.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you.
All right, and then Lulu, I see you up there in the corner. Are you looking to ask a question? Oh, sorry, we're repeating that. There you go, all yours.
Did I wave or something? I came late. I sent my Representative Jetson for Seattle Girls School. We're going to a lobby day on Tuesday.
Wonderful.
Nice.
Thank you.
I don't know if Jetson introduced himself earlier.
Okay, so let's see. Is there anyone else on the call who would like a chance for one last question before we close out? All right, seeing nothing, thank you everyone for joining us for the last hour. Thank you to Monisha and Tobi and Catherine for joining us, and Fedra for participating in a lot of the organizing of this event as well. Even though she can't be here in person. We will, again, send out a reminder of all the bills that people have talked about today. We've got February 11th as LGBTQ Lobby Day in Olympia. You can register on equalrightswashington.org. There will also be an update from the Washington State LGBTQ Legislative Caucus sometime in February. We are working with them to find the right date where they can share with the community about what they are doing themselves on the floors of the House and Senate there. So thank you everyone for joining us. We've got a great session ahead of us, and please do stay engaged. So have a great night.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.